So to introduce myself, my name is Molly Nix. I'm a senior product designer at Uber, and I'm here to talk to you today about how Uber designs for the future of transportation. Specifically about the challenges that come with designing for a scale that's so massive, it's changing the way that cities move, it's providing jobs for people around the world, and completely reimagining the concept of logistics. So, quick question to the audience. How many of you have ever taken an Uber before? Yes. So another raise of hands, but this time different. How many of you have ever driven with Uber before? Yeah. Okay, but it looks like way less of you, dramatically. And up until a year and a half ago, when I started Uber, I was like most of you, where I had limited exposure of what the driver experience was like. But a lot of my work at Uber has been on the driver partner side. And my team's job is to create experiences to facilitate this new type of work that the world has never seen before. And the focus of what I talk about today is going to be techniques and approaches for unpacking a complex problem space, building true and deep empathy with your users, especially in contexts that you might not be familiar with, and being sure that you're solving the right problems in the first place. Now, before we get into this, I want to take this chance to introduce myself. Who am I, specifically Uber, and why am I here to talk to you today? So, I mentioned before, I'm Molly. I work on the driver partner experience at Uber, as well as at the Advanced Technologies group. And then, in the spirit of saying one non-work thing about myself as an icebreaker, I also have applied that background in design to one of my personal interests, which is making furniture. And the best way for me to disconnect, because I stare at a screen all day at my job, is to go out and make things with my hands. So throughout my talk, I'm going to be doing a little bit of metaphor making to show how really this type of process and approach can be applied to a broad range of projects and contexts, so that hopefully all of you, regardless of the type of design that you practice, can take away a few lessons learned. So let's get into it. I'm going to talk about 4 key guidelines for what it takes to design at Uber. And all of us in this room as designers can take forward in the work that we do every day. The important thing to note here is that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to design process, but this is a rough set of principles and guidelines to help drive your process Uber style. So let's start off with that first one, starting small and scaling quickly. Uber started in 2010 as a simple idea: push a button and get a ride. The goal is to make the technology invisible and have a magical experience that transports you from here to there. And Uber began only 6 years ago, and that's what it looked like, as a service for 100 friends in San Francisco to get luxury rides. And before UberX, which is the more economical service that we offer, launched in 2012, taking an Uber meant that you were going somewhere in San Francisco for something more than $30. But already this simple idea introduces the first layer of complexity when designing at Uber. Uber is a two-sided marketplace. Riders use Uber as a platform to get them where they need to go, and then drivers use Uber as a source of income. The flexibility of being your own boss, with your own hours on your own terms. And from a product perspective, this already means that you have 2 different experiences to design. In this case, mobile apps, with 2 very different needs and requirements for both. You seem to all mostly know about the rider side, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the partner app, and it seems like a lot of you are less familiar with that. So the partner app, which is for drivers, enables a driver partner to tell Uber that they're ready to drive, to get new trip requests, to tell them where the rider is, to get them to where the rider's going, and then to do that all over again until they've decided that they're done for the day. And the very first partner app wasn't really anything crazy or complex. So there's a request, and that's where the rider is. That's kind of about it. But with this straightforward system, Uber started to expand dramatically. And in this visualization, you can see a day of trips in New York on 2014 compared to 2015. Even 4 years into Uber being in New York, it continues to grow at a dramatically fast pace. So as rides increased, so did our opportunity to think about how to make Uber a more efficient system as a whole. In this visualization, you can see that by the bright lines that many people are taking the same trip at the same time. So this observation begs the question, how might Uber play a role in reducing congestion in our cities? And then another raise of hands, how many of you have ever taken Uber Pool before? Okay, looks like less of you. I don't think it's here in Santiago, so hopefully soon. Excuse me. In 2014, Uber Pool came on the scene. And Uber Pool makes it easy for people who are going the same place at the same time to share a ride. And it's all about getting more people into fewer cars and making cheaper rides for passengers, and then also longer trips for drivers and less congestion in our cities. So we're dealing with a growing complexity of the product itself and a dramatically increased scope and scale of the problem. But all of this has the need to maintain a simple, clear UI inside the apps that we have for both riders and for driver partners. On the driver partner side specifically, those challenges come with questions like, how might we design an interface that's clear enough for a driver to get around the city in order to know where to go and pick up riders and drop off riders concurrently without ever really looking at the UI? So Uber Pool is expanding our reach in markets that we already operate in, but meanwhile, Uber is rapidly expanding around the globe. So today, actually, Brazil is in Uber's top 5 biggest businesses after the US and India. Sao Paulo is Sao Paulo is number 2. Mexico City is the busiest Uber city in the world. We are in 6 continents and in 72 countries. And in Silicon Valley, at least, designers tend to fall prey to designing with a more technology-forward consumer in mind. Designs tend to emphasize the latest trends or the latest interaction paradigms. And while users of all kinds exist in the US, usability issues are magnified in markets like India, where a lot of our drivers who drive with Uber are given a smartphone when they first start, and this smartphone is the first ever smartphone that they've used. So with that global expansion also comes a range of UX challenges, specifically a growing range of technical proficiency, varying literacy rates, and with designs, it's even more important that clarity take precedent over cleverness, and that every affordance and reduction of text goes a long way to making sure that our interfaces are clear and usable to all of our users. So we've seen this global scale change and massive growth. So let's see this all together, and I'll walk you through what an Uber Pool trip is like. I'm going to try to voice over video, so let's go. So you start driving, you get a new request. You accept that, and now you go to pick up George. Drive, arrive, George gets in your car, you start his trip. Now you're driving, you get a new request. And this is actually another rider who's been matched that's taking you about the same way that George was going, and so you go pick them up. That slightly changes the route that you're going to take. So you go, you pick that rider up, they get in your car, you start that trip, and then you go to drop George off, and then he gets out of the car, and then you drop that second rider off. And this process just continues. So you drop the second rider off, and now you get a new request, another one, you drop off, another request, and that flow continues until you are done for the day. So, wow, that is quite a difference between that one-dimensional functionality that we started out with to this extensible trip framework that scales to include many different trips and tasks. And actually, this only scratches the surface of the complexity that a lot of our partners have to deal with. We also do things like food delivery, or actually in Santiago, cash trips. which definitely adds to the complexity that a partner is doing while they're using this device in their car. So showing this gradual growth and transition is the first lesson in today's talk about the process of design and product development at Uber, starting small and scaling quickly. And I mentioned before about how I'm going to make furniture metaphors, so I'll tell you how this applies to making furniture as well. You don't have to be a carpenter to build furniture. You have to start small and slowly build your skills over time. I am an amateur, novice furniture maker. So as pictured here, my first piece was me going to the beach, picking up a piece of wood and sticking a plant into it, and I called it art. And then I went to a wood shop where I found a scrap wood bin and a really nice piece of walnut. So I sanded that down, put some wood oil on it, and then it was a cutting board. And then making a dining room table was kind of just like a really big cutting board covered in concrete. And so it's all about the theme with me in building furniture is that I don't have a shop, which I see as a design constraint. And my skill set is pretty limited and self-taught. I don't have no formal training. But I try to just keep tackling bigger and bigger projects. So how can you make sure you're moving bigger and bigger in the right direction? That question brings us to our next section, which is designing the right thing. And this is different from designing the thing right. I have no idea if that's going to translate well. So a lot of very smart people, actually in this room included, have come up with very smart frameworks to think about design process. One of the ones that we use at Uber is a technique called double diamond, and I'll explain it a little bit for those who are not familiar with it, but this was developed by the British Design Council. And it can be summarized as 2 diamonds. The first diamond is where you design the right thing, which is this section in this talk. And the second diamond is where the execution stage, and this is where you design the thing right or you create the outcome. And the first important point is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to design process, as I mentioned before, but it's important for designers to develop a robust problem-solving toolkit for problem identification and problem solving. So back to furniture really quickly for a second. When you start with a blank space, the opportunities are limitless. There's 100 different things you could do and 1,000 questions you should be asking. Who lives here? What is the space used for? Who will be using the space? And the way that I approach furniture and design for myself is that because it's a hobby for me, it's really actually always for myself. And it's great because it's one of those places that I can truly be selfish with the work that I do, which is definitely not the case when you're designing for a context like Uber, where very likely the user is very different from yourself. So how do you start to understand who this person is and what they need? One of the strongest attributes a designer can have is the ability to observe, have empathy, and then translate those insights into designs that solve problems rooted in human need. And I'm going to talk about 3 methods that Uber designers and researchers use to gain understanding and empathy, which involve getting into the shoes, the cars, and even sometimes inviting users in to become designers themselves. And the first one is true participation. And this is getting into your user's shoes as much as possible. And this is me. I am actually going out driving, picking up real Uber passengers, and recording my experience for my team so that they can share the insights that I've gained from doing that. And outside of talking to our users, one of the most powerful tools that we have at our disposal is becoming drivers ourselves. So this is not just me that does that. Designers, PMs, engineers, many different roles at Uber go out and they all drive and they all pick up passengers so they can truly learn what using the product is like firsthand from the driver's perspective. And this allows us to truly build empathy with our driver partners and internalize the pain points and seek opportunities to improve the product. So personally, from driving, I have felt like what it feels like to be waiting outside your rider's pickup spot on a busy, dark road with 4 lanes of traffic around you, risking getting a ticket. And you know in these contexts that there's truly no way that you can be asked to focus on a phone in a difficult situation like this. Yesterday, we heard Laura Martini talk about the importance of high contrast and intentional use of color in the context for designing for healthcare systems. And how she looks to airplane cockpits as a source of inspiration for guiding principles of clear, powerful design. That same idea definitely applies to designing for driving. And it's these principles that we theoretically know to be true when we're sitting at our desks and designing on a screen. But when you're driving and a pop-up appears with 3 small lines of text, and there's absolutely no way that you can read that because you have 2 eyes on the road, that's how we internalize these principles to optimize for designing for driving. And so this is all great, but as it turns out, you also are not the user. So how else can you bring participation into your design process? And that is bringing your users directly into your design process. And actually, we heard Renato Verdugo talk about this morning, where YouTube uses a similar approach for treating your users as stakeholders in the design process. And recently, to drive our future direction of the Uber partner experience, we invited driver partners into our brainstorming. We had them pair up with designers and tell us what their issues were, enjoyable moments, and then actually participate in their own sketching and idea generation workshop so that they can design features for us. And by involving driver partners in our process, we were able to inject everything from their broader thoughts, their issues, and product ideas directly into the beginning of the design process. And then we have their stories and their insights guiding us throughout the entire process. And so all of those early decisions around design direction are shaped directly from them. And so on the other end of the spectrum, true observation is going out and being a fly on the wall. In general, when you do research, it's often recruiting is a difficult and time-consuming part of research process. And so an amazing thing about Uber is that it's one of the only services that I can think of where we essentially have something that is push a button, get a participant. All of a sudden, a driver partner pulls up, and this is really, really powerful when you have a quick question or a concept to validate. And when I ride in cars, I actually try not to mention that I work for Uber, not in any nefarious way, but rather it's better to get a raw, unbiased perspective from the people who we're trying to solve problems for without it being under the pretense of Uber-sponsored research where you're subject to get different answers. So finally, kind of bringing these two concepts together, one-on-one interviews with driver partners is also a very common technique that we use. I'm going to talk about a specific project where we did this. I'm first going to take a sip of water. Recently, we were looking at ways to help people who were new to driving with Uber get started and prepared to get on the road. We talked to dozens of new driver partners in both the US and in China to try to learn firsthand what questions they have when they're first starting out. And beyond just asking questions, we ended up taking it a step further and actually took their first real Uber trip with them with us as passengers, so we can observe directly what issues they would actually have on their first real trip. So once we had all this initial data, what do we do next? In addition to that foundational research directly with driver partners, we reached out to the operations teams around the world. So operations are the eyes and ears in every city that Uber operates in. They're here in Santiago. And they're the ones who work tirelessly to make Uber run and operate in every city that Uber is in. And so we wanted to see what they were doing to help onboard new driver partners and what they were doing to teach them how the driving experience works. We asked them what product opportunities they thought would best serve this problem. And out of that outreach, we actually ended up getting one resounding feature request from around the world. And this was to build a practice trip in the partner app. And so what they wanted is a way for a driver partner to kind of get in their car and go through a real Uber trip, except without ever picking a passenger up. And this is a great idea. There's no downside. But there's one actual key issue with this idea. And when you think about what a practice trip is, it would mean that you're actually behind the wheel, and you're seeing a brand new app for the first time in that context. And going back to our research, actually, our research showed that a new driver partner got fairly easily overwhelmed when they were actually behind the wheel and asked to both drive and learn something new at the same time. So this is because they're seeing an app for the first time that's brand new, and then also all of that difficulty I mentioned before about having 4 lanes of traffic around you, that's not the time to learn something new. So from this, our guiding principle for our design process was that when you're actually driving should not be the first time that you're ever exposed to a brand new UI and a brand new concept that you haven't seen before. So instead, we actually wanted to refocus to a key question, which is, what is the real problem we're trying to solve with this solution? And a big theme that we've heard at this conference, and actually Alex Osorio mentioned in her talk about chasing problems, is that it's important to be problem first and not solution first. And let's sink that in for a second, because it's such a driving force for the work that we do every day. Problem first, not solution first. So if you look at this practice trip idea, it was actually a solution to 2 different problems. One is that a driver partner did not have a clear understanding of how a trip on Uber worked. And then 2, once they're in the car, they're absolutely overwhelmed by a brand new UI and a brand new context, and everything that they theoretically learned when they were out of the car didn't matter, doesn't retain. So to address that, we refocused the problem space into 2 different parts. One is, how do we design an experience that prepares a new driver for what a trip will entail by teaching them the mechanics of how a trip on Uber works, and then support them as they actually start to drive and they're on their first several trips. It's important to realize that complex problems don't often come with single solutions, and understanding the context that the user is in or the journey that they've taken to get there is the key to unpacking these service design challenges. So this is a light overview of how we unpacked this problem space, and I'll talk about how this project played out in a little bit, but I wanted to take a second to talk about how to get the importance of getting buy-in from your team. And so ultimately, design is just a way of solving problems. Designers, researchers, product managers, engineers, data scientists, you name it, marketing, operations, and actually whatever titles that all of you in this room have, everyone should be a part of the design process. Better work and better products will be the result. So design is really just the process in which Uber builds products. And if design was simply seen as a stage in the process, maybe coming in later, it would inherit all of the decisions made prior to the design starting, which we refer to in the industry as putting lipstick on a pig. So the best thing that you can do to get this buy-in and empathy from your teammates is actually have them along for the ride, and in this case, quite literally, when a researcher and I brought one of our engineers on our team into the car with us so that he could see what the experience was like firsthand that he was building. What you actually can't see in this picture is he also has his laptop with him, and he's actively fixing bugs as he sees them while the car is driving, which is awesome. Just what we like to see. Excuse me. So at Uber, we are lucky to work alongside engineers that care enough about the product that they're building to want to come along to do that. So it means that they care enough to want to learn what the research process is like. And so even when doing things like small-scale usability studies, having roles like engineers or product managers directly observe and maybe asking them to be the note takers of the session ensures that we're building empathy across the organization. So, okay, next section. So now that you have a solid understanding of the problem space, you've talked to your users, you have a clear articulation of the problem that you're going to solve, your whole team is bought into this process, now is the time to actually start the part of the design process that most people consider design. So how do you start that out? With furniture? The first lesson is to find any way that you can to prototype your solution. And you want to try to learn as much as possible without investing resources into building something that might not work. So take a piece of wood, put it on a chair, add a cardboard box. You want to feel the space and start to understand sort of a deeper level of understanding of what the outcome should look like. Only then do you go out and you find the right materials, you make decisions around styling, and then you build it, you put it into place, and you adjust. So that's the beautifully oversimplified version I try to follow in making furniture. But going back to the actual Uber part of the process, inevitably by now you have some sort of idea of what you want to build. And so this is where you start to explore a broad range of possibilities and design directions. And the best way to do this is actually quite simple. It's just start somewhere and make something. So some designers prefer to start out in notebooks, sketching on paper. Others hop right into their favorite program and make wireframes. And if you're really crazy, you dive into high-fidelity prototyping. And there's no right answer with this step, but the only guideline is that the broader the scope of the problem, the less fidelity you should probably start with. So from an early concept, for example, starting with a high-fidelity solution might get you feedback on things like visual treatment, but when you're really looking to get feedback on the broader concept, it's best to kind of take a step back and use more of a wireframe fidelity. So relating to fidelity, let's bring it back to that project about helping new drivers start out with Uber. So in this second part, which is about supporting drivers through their first real trip, we want to figure out what information is important to help new drivers when they're actually doing a trip for the first time. And from all that base knowledge about designing for driving, we knew that we had to reduce the amount of complexity on the screen and then keep elements that are important like the map, which is telling the driver where to go. But the idea, and bear with me for a second, is that we wanted to create turn-by-turn navigation except for UI. So kind of like how a voice speaks out and tells you to turn right at the end of the road, but for buttons on the screen. So also in principle, kind of similar to the types of coach marks that you might see on a screen when you first open up an app for the first time that tells you how a button works or how to move forward in a flow. But in this case, you're learning something while you have 2 hands on the wheel and 2 eyes on the road, and it's important to maintain that. And you're also in a context where you're already listening to your phone telling you what turns to make. So that was the idea. It was add an instruction like slide the green bar to start the trip at the screen in which that step appears. This reminds them how to use this brand new UI and what to do at each step in the flow. So the question becomes, how do we build something that we can learn from quickly? From our evaluation research sessions, we knew we wanted everything to work exactly as a normal trip would, except with this extra added component of voice. So that's where we got a little bit creative in prototyping methods. We used the actual partner app. I sat in the backseat of a car with a laptop, and I read out the instructions that we thought would be good at each step in the trip flow. This is great because it required no real design work. It was literally just improv. So we had this standard list of instructions that we identified based on our initial foundational research. But this format gave us the flexibility if there was a specific moment that a participant was having trouble with, I could improvise and just add in a new line of instruction text and then try to evaluate its performance with that specific driver partner. Then we can use that instruction for all of the kind of following participants that we had in our research studies. So what did we learn from all of this? The faster that you get your ideas in contact with the real world, the faster you can find out what is wrong with them and then improve them. So low fidelity prototyping, even as easy as that Wizard of Oz technique that I just showed you, is the easiest way to get this quick feedback that you're looking for without investing a lot of upfront resources. It's also important to know that sort of prototyping comes in many different shapes and sizes. It's common for designers to think that a prototype means something that you coded up in Framer or you put together in Principle. But really, you want something that gets the information that you're needing at the fidelity of question that you want to answer. So it's all about kind of asking what information are you actually looking for with that prototype that you're building. And now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about a different project where we learn key insights later in the process when we were at more of a high fidelity stage. So 1.5 years ago, the driver design team set out to tackle a ground-up redesign of the partner app. So far in this talk, I've been talking about the part of the partner experience, what happens when you're in the car, we call on trip. But this project focuses specifically on everything that happens when a driver partner is out of the car, or not on trips. So the goals of this project were to take the app as something with limited functionality, which was essentially going online, taking trips, and inviting friends to Uber, to becoming the one-stop shop for managing your business. And this included a whole new addition and set of functionality, such as checking your earnings or monitoring your feedback from your riders. So we wanted to make sure we were designing information architecture that reflects what's most important to partners and not the organization that we designed within. So through research, we identified the 4 key buckets. The first one is knowing when and where to drive and getting timely information, and this is the Home tab. Then tracking your earnings and finding out about opportunities to earn more. This is the Earnings tab. Then getting feedback from your riders and learning how you can improve. This is the Ratings tab. And then finally managing all of your information, and this is in the Account tab. So our process for arriving on an overall app design and structure after the initial problem framing and foundational research was complete was to start with wireframes, exploring a vast number of possible design directions. And then we conducted weekly iterative usability studies. This one looks like it was conducted in a prison, but over the course of a month, where we would put the latest designs of the prototype, whether it be a piece of paper with a screenshot on it, or a full tap-through interactive prototype. Excuse me. We put each prototype in front of driver partners to get their feedback. And we learned a lot and changed a lot during this process. But one of our blind spots in this process was that we ended up limiting our research pretty much to driver partners in California. So as I mentioned before, Uber is this massive global product, and this is a direct violation of the guideline that I gave earlier in the presentation, which was design global first. So we learned a lot from this mishap. But when we finally ended up taking our prototype to India, fairly late in the process, the moment we put it in front of users, we learned interesting insights related to the visual details that drastically changed the initial understanding of the UI itself. So I'll give you a little bit of background for that. As mentioned before, driver partners in India have never, lots of driver partners in India have never used a smartphone before the one that they use to drive with Uber. In addition to this, driver partners in India have varying literacy rates, or are able to read in their local language, but maybe not in English, which is actually the default that most of the phones that they use are set to. So often, driver partners in India rely much more heavily on iconography in order to memorize where features are located within the app. And so this poster is actually something that's posted in the onboarding center in Ahmedabad, India. And what you can see here is that the app is in English. It has kind of call-outs in Hindi and then labels in Gujarati, which is the local language in that state. So you can see that they're also kind of struggling with this way to kind of communicate what we need to partners with varying literacy rates. So on top of all of this issue of language and understanding, drivers in India also deal with frequent network connectivity issues, which is really challenging if your job is to drive around and get requests on your phone that fundamentally depends on having a network connection. So we had home, earnings, ratings, account. And we had the iconography already, so this was helpful because driver partners in India also often are visual, rely on visual cues. So we showed this design to driver partners in India, and then almost unanimously, drivers thought that that second tab from the left was where they would go to manage their network settings. And that seemed really random to us Americans who usually we only lose network connectivity if we're off hiking or in a tunnel. So why did they think this was for network settings? There's two real reasons. One is because network connectivity is top of mind for drivers in that region, and also the icon that we selected looks like the network settings bar. So, and also the second reason is that things like bar charts don't communicate well to drivers in that market. It's not a relatable way to communicate that earnings information because bar charts, you require kind of a math education to understand. So we changed the icon to be a more clear, literal interpretation of money rather than an abstract representation of a bar chart. And this was a case where a really seemingly small detail, like an icon selection, when combined in the context of a low network connectivity environment, ended up having really drastic impact on the clarity of our UI. And it's in moments like this where designing the thing right becomes increasingly important. So this is the part of the talk also where we start to talk about the other part that people think is most of the design process, which is making things move, making things pretty, or my favorite description, making things pop. And this is a very important part of the design process, as this is what sets our products apart. It's your brand, it's the feeling people have when they're using your product. And how does Uber talk about that? So Uber lives by this traditional mantra, useful, usable, desirable, and we end up tacking on one extra element, which is made with love. So this is where delight sits. Don Norman had a TED Talk in 2003 where he talked about sort of the three components of emotion that constitute delight. The first one is visceral, and this is the initial impact of the experience. The second one is behavioral, and this is how the total experience and performance. And then the third one is reflective, and that's how the product makes you feel. And what I love most about this framework is that it adds a weight and a dimension to a part of design that we as designers kind of know and feel, but ultimately it's hard to quantify. And a lot of times the people that we work with every day that are a little bit more maybe skeptical about the value of delight in design, it adds weight to that kind of concern. So what are some of the ways that Uber thinks about delight? Our branding and our videos like this are examples of how we achieve visceral delight in the work that we do through product design and through branding. It's beautiful, it's emotional, it's elevated, it wows you with its movement and its dynamics, and it elevates the feeling of the product itself. And so another quick raise of hands, actually. How many of you have ever experienced Uber ice cream? Cool, okay, less of you. So I wasn't sure if that would be a thing that people knew. Uber ice cream is an example of behavioral delights. And this video is from right here in Santiago, which is kind of why I asked if any of you have actually seen it before. And for those not familiar, this is one day a year when Uber turns into push a button, get ice cream delivered around the globe. And so beyond the visceral packaging design and the cute decals on the cars, fundamentally, what scenario could be more delightful than pushing a button and having ice cream delivered to your doorstep? So that said, actually, judging by all the jackets in this video, I think we could make it a little bit more delightful if we change the season that it runs in. So then we move on to reflective delight. And this is how the entire product makes you feel. And we like to think of the entire Uber experience as an example of this. So reflective is a type of delight where you know your life is better because you have the flexibility to earn income that works within your schedule. Or the type of delight that you can feel that knowing wherever you go, you have a safe, reliable ride home. And it extends far beyond what we typically think of when we think of delight, but it's perhaps the most important value that we as designers and as product creators can deliver. So now back to our process. I promise this last section is shorter. Once you have your project shipped, it's solving problems, it's delighting users around the globe, and millions of people are using it every day. You're all done, right? You can go home, job complete. No, you have to do it all over again. So in any in-house design team, you also have to be comfortable doing it all over again, even as soon as your design is out the door. So the way that you learn is never being afraid to go back to design the right thing stage, which is where you take what you just launched and then question all of the initial assumptions that you made at the beginning of that process. Because likely the world has changed in the time that it took you to build that thing in the first place. So in the world we operate in, the design you make today will likely not be here in a year from now, and almost certainly will not be here 5 years from now. So despite launching a brand new partner app last year, we already are thinking about ways to tear it all down and improve it once again, given all the insights that we've gained in the last year. And the beauty of working in a context where you have full control over the design outcome is that you can go back and reassess and reevaluate all the decisions that you made prior. And this is actually one of my favorite things about working on an in-house design team versus an agency, because it allows you to have full control of the product after you've delivered it. So one more example of furniture, or in this case ceramics. There are projects which you will not always get right the first time. So the one on the left is the first cup that I ever made. I did not mean for it to look that way. The colors are wrong, the shape is lopsided, but you do it over again. The next one's a little bit closer, still some issues, and then finally that third attempt probably gets you a little bit closer to what you were going for. And so all of these cups are serving their needs, they're holding coffee, but ultimately we wanted to look at sort of the entire cup journey of all aspects of delight. So kind of to wrap this up, when Uber thinks of terms like service design, the best service transcends the whole journey, which is digital to physical and not just that destination. Uber has this exciting mission to transform transportation, and in ways that are uniquely beneficial to individual cities. And we look to all aspects of the Uber experience for opportunities to iterate and improve upon our experience as a whole. So the Uber experience does consider this whole, which is human to human to computer, and human to city. And so kind of to summarize, design is this process of framing work that allows you to come into different situations and make it successful each time. I hope the several examples I have given have illustrated sort of how the beauty of design is that there's no right answer, and knowing which methodologies and techniques to use is often a design project in itself. So starting small, establishing true and deep empathy with your users, identifying problems, tirelessly searching for a solution, all of this behind the scenes stuff comes together so that you can deliver a simple human experience for your customer and allow us to help people spend their time in more meaningful ways. And that's it. Thank you.
Grande applauso, grandissimo applauso para Molly Nix. Thank you very much, Molly.